Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Sophie Mitra. I'm a professor of economics at Fordham University, and I would like to welcome you to the 2022 Fordham Distinguished Lecture in Economics. I'll start by noting that we have enabled automated captions, so you can turn on captions if you'd like. The Fordham's Distinguished Lecture in Economics is in its third year. This lecture series is made possible by support from the Office of the Chief Diversity Officer, the Conference of Arts and Science Deans, and the Economics Department. So Janet Curry gave the inaugural lecture in December 2019, and last year Derek Hamilton gave the second lecture. This event is organized by the Climate Committee of the Economics Department. The Climate Committee examines issues and develops resources to enhance diversity and inclusion in economics at Fordham, and it includes faculty and students. So the main purpose of this lecture is to expose students to a topic or a scholar that they might not typically study in the introductory courses, and thus expand the sources and the scholars they're learning from. So turning to today's lecture, I would like to especially thank Matthew Maresca and Jacqueline Reed, who did so much work to make the lecture possible. So the event will be in two parts. We'll start with a lecture by Dr. Stephanie Stancheva, and it will be followed by Q&A. The Q&A will be moderated by Dr. Suba Mani. So feel free to start typing questions or comments during the talk. So let me introduce you to our moderator, Suba Mani, who is known and loved by many of you already. So Suba is a development economist at Fordham. Her main area of interest deals with understanding the causes and pathways through which human capital, so health, education, vocational training, language training can be accumulated for young children and adults. She has examined these issues specifically using data for Indonesia, India, Ethiopia, Peru, and Vietnam, and has worked on many experimental and non-experimental evaluation studies. Now, turning to our distinguished speaker, Stephanie Stancheva is the Nathaniel Ropes Professor of Political Economy at Harvard and founder of the Social Economics Lab. So Stephanie received her PhD in economics from MIT and was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows before joining the Harvard Department of Economics. She is currently co-editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Stephanie has received various prestigious awards, including the 2020 Elaine Bennett Research Prize. This prize recognizes and honors outstanding research in economics. So Dr. Stancheva studies the taxation of firms and individuals using a mix of theoretical and empirical methods. Her work has centered around the effects of tax policy on innovation, education, and wealth. Another line of work is how people understand, perceive, and form their attitudes towards taxation, healthcare, immigration, environmental policies, and social mobility using large-scale social economic surveys and experiments. So today's lecture will present new evidence on how people think about economic policy issues using large-scale social economic surveys and experiments in several countries. So Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. I'm really delighted, although I can't see you all in front of me, but hopefully this will be something interesting for many of you. So today I want to tell you a little bit about new research findings about people's views on economic policies. And we will focus more precisely on redistribution policies, such as progressive taxation, social insurance, transfers to lower income families, education policy. And why are these so important? Well, it probably is familiar to you that inequality is rising in many countries across the world, and finding better policies to act against it is quite urgent. But we can't just study what the effects of policies are. This is very important and a huge part of what we do as economists. But we also need to understand how people think about these policies. And so this is a bit the goal of this talk and this whole research agenda. And so hopefully you can come out of here with a better understanding of how some of people's policy views on economic policies are formed. So I will start by telling you very briefly about the core method that we use here so that you can have a sense where these results come from. And then I will actually go through a little framework that will help us organize our thinking before I then dive into 4 specific aspects of people's economic policy views. So first, on the method. So the projects we will cover are done in the social economics lab at Harvard. And we call it social economics because it's about how people form views on economic issues and think about economic topics, but taking into account social phenomena and their broader social context. And the method we use is a new generation of social economic surveys and experiments that we can leverage to better understand how people think about the economy and economic policies. And surveys are really a key research tool. In a sense, they're a way to get into people's minds and sort of listen to them. And of course, surveys have existed for a very long time. But historically, they've mainly been used to measure things like income, family situation, employment, etc., that are now much better measured in administrative high-quality data like tax records or security records that we can use as researchers. Another type of surveys that's been around for very long are, polls that ask people's opinion on specific issues, but without going in more depth about why they think so, what's their reasoning, etc. And so these surveys are a key tool because there's some things which are invisible in other data, even in great data. These are things like perceptions, attitudes, knowledge, or views. And so these are things which we can actually learn about much better by asking people more directly. And of course, for the results to be reliable, it's very critical that the surveys are well designed, that they're carefully calibrated, and that they're deployed on appropriate sample. So there's a lot of work that goes into the design and to ensure high quality answers, as well as representative or targeted samples. And in addition, they can be made nicely interactive. For instance, you can show different sets of information experimentally to different respondents. And so obviously these types of tools are more and more in use in research. And so before we continue, I want to start with a little framework that will help us organize our thinking before we dive into specific projects. So how should we think about our mental models as citizens when we decide what policies to support? And let's specifically focus on redistribution policies. So think of, will you vote on increasing taxes or making taxes more progressive in order to finance lower income family transfers? So when we think about redistribution policy, implicitly or explicitly, we form views on the following factors listed here. First, we form some views on the so-called efficiency costs of the policy or efficiency effects. So those are the economic costs or benefits from the policy. For instance, what will happen to economic activity if we implement it? Will people stop working? Will it increase unemployment? Will it hurt growth, etc.? Second, again, implicitly or implicitly, we think about the distributional impacts, which is essentially which groups will lose from the policy and which groups will gain from the policy. Is it going to be, for instance, mostly lower income households, or some type of particular people like students or retirees, or maybe immigrants or minorities, which will gain or lose? So we tend to form judgments on the perceived distributional impacts. Third, we do form some view as well about how fair we think the policy is, which is related to concerns such as how fair is the inequality that we see in the world to start with? Do we think people are entitled to keep their income? Is their income the result of their own effort or of luck? What are the consequences of that inequality, etc.? And then fourth, we also implicitly form some views about government, in particular, how trustworthy, how competent, how benevolent the government is. And government as an institution rather than a particular government or administration in place. And this is important because ultimately the government is the institution that will pass and arrange the implementation of these policies. And so let's take very specifically the example of tax policy to see how this framework can be applied when we think about people's views on tax policy. And this will be actually based on a recent project I did where you can see these findings very much in the data. So tax policy is an example of a highly polarized policy. So by polarized, I mean that people hold radically different views about what taxes should be, but also about what taxes actually do. So if we go through this framework that we just outlined, and it's of course a very stylized summary here, but it can give you a very clear idea of all the differences at every step that informs our different policy views. And the views on tax policies can be actually very succinctly summarized by whether you're a more left-leaning person politically or a more right-leaning person politically. That's kind of the biggest difference you can see across people, much bigger than differences by income, by education, by age, etc. So if you're someone who's generally more on the left, you will tend to think that taxes have smaller economic costs overall. You will also be more likely to think that raising taxes to increase revenues is going to help many people. And you don't really believe in this idea of trickle down. That is, you don't really believe that cutting taxes on top earners will ultimately benefit everyone, that it's going to be the tide that lifts all boats. You will also tend to view inequality as mostly unfair. You believe that, for instance, while people can influence their income and outcomes with their own effort and with individual action, still there's a lot of luck and circumstances outside of people's control that can shape their lives in good or bad ways. And then you will also tend to think that the government should have a relatively broad scope. A government should do relatively many things, and you trust it more as an institution. And so if you're someone who's more right-leaning, it will be essentially the opposite on many of these issues here. And actually, finally, there's a final bullet here called reality. So what is that? Well, it turns out that even if we get down to the basic level of reality, people on the left and right will actually think quite differently. And we call this the polarization of reality, because it's about things that are plain facts that you can in principle Google and find, and yet we hold very different perceptions of them. So for instance, someone on the left will tend to think that taxes are currently lower and less progressive, and that there's more inequality than someone on the right. And none of the groups is systematically more accurate than the other, but these gaps are consistently in the same direction. So even on things which are basic facts that one can actually research on the internet or find in a reference work, there's a polarization gap for these perceptions. And you can also ask which one matters more. So which of these factors that differ across people is ultimately the most important one when it comes to support for redistribution. And in the end, if you try to horse race these considerations and see what matters, what informs different policy views, it turns out that the most important concern to people is who they think wins and who loses and how fair that is. So to put it very simply, the core reason that we as citizens support different policies, according to the data, is not because of our different views on the economic costs or benefits of these policies. It's because we have very different perceptions of who wins, who loses from these policies, and we have very different notions of what is fair. So fairness is very much in the eye of the beholder. And this is why, in the rest of the talk, I will focus on some of the key factors that I and co-authors have explored that shape people's perceptions of who wins, who loses from policies, and how fair they think that is. And the issues we'll cover in that order are listed here. I'll start with social mobility, switch to views about immigrants, talk about racial attitudes, and then think about people's perceptions of their own ranking among others. So let's dive straight into the first topic that shapes people's views on who gains, who loses, and how fair that is, which is social mobility. So in this paper, we ask, what is the link between intergenerational mobility, or rather perceived intergenerational mobility, and people's preferred redistribution policies? If you think about some of the existing economic theories that you may be familiar with, These theories suggest that the more you believe in equality of opportunity, that means that everyone has equal chances to start with, and the more willing you will be to tolerate inequality of outcomes. Because if everyone has the same opportunities to start with, then outcomes are more likely to be the result of individual merit. And so you're more willing to accept inequality in the resulting outcomes. But are people's perceptions of mobility in line with reality at all? So we conducted several surveys in 5 countries. The countries are France, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US, and with samples ranging between 2,000 and 4,000 respondents. And as I alluded to in the introduction, a lot of work goes into actually designing these questions so that they're intuitive and clear and that people can actually understand what we're asking. So on this slide, you can see an example of how we actually ask people about their knowledge and their perceptions about intergenerational mobility. So we show them these 2 ladders side by side, and in a text above that's not shown here, we tell them that they can consider 500 families that represent the US population, and that on the left, we see the parents' income distribution as represented by the ladder with each rung, ranging from the poorest 100 families to the richest 100 families. And on the right, we see the children's ladder. That's the children's income distribution once the children become adults, once they grow up. Again, ranging from the 100 poorest to the 100 richest. And we ask respondents to consider 100 children who are born in the 100 poorest families and to allocate them to each of the 5 groups of families when they grow up. And their answers, as they enter them in each box, the total at the bottom adjusts interactively and has to sum up to 100. And so based on that, we can actually see, what do people imagine are the chances of children who are born in poverty? What do they think will happen to these children when they grow up? And so what do we find across countries? Let's start with a perceived probability of remaining stuck in poverty. So this is the number of children people think will remain in that bottom rung of the ladder if they are born in a family at the bottom rung. So on this figure, you can see 1 dot per country in the sample. So on the horizontal axis, these are the actual probabilities based on the actual data of children remaining stuck in the bottom quintile. So for instance, in the US, 33 children out of 100 that are born in the bottom quintile will remain there when they grow up. And that number is 27 for Sweden. So actually, according to this metric, European countries and the UK are more mobile than the US. So the idea of the US being a very high mobility country, at least relative to these other European countries, is not true. And then on the vertical axis, you can see the average perception for respondents in that country. So I have labeled the upper region pessimistic because dots that land in this region mean that people tend to underestimate mobility. They tend to be too pessimistic about the probability of staying stuck in poverty. The lower area, on the other hand, is too optimistic. That's where people overestimate mobility, according to this metric. So you can see that European respondents in general are too pessimistic for that measure. They tend to overestimate the chance of remaining stuck in the bottom. So they're not just more pessimistic than people in the US, they're also overly pessimistic relative to reality. The US is quite accurate here for this metric. So let's look at another measure of mobility, which you could actually call the American dream, this idea of making it from rags to riches. So we can measure this by how many children from the bottom rung of the ladder will make it to the very top when they grow up. So let's see what people think. So this chart works in the same way as the previous one. So on the horizontal axis, you have the actual probability, this time of a child born in the bottom quintile, making it to the very top. And you can see that the American dream, so to speak, is actually least alive in the US. So in the US, it's the lowest number of children from the bottom quintile that will make it to the top quintile. The exact number is 7.8. And while European countries are more mobile, and they're relatively accurate, again, perhaps too pessimistic this time on the probability of making it from rags to riches, the most striking misperception is how over-optimistic people in the US are. So this idea of the American dream is still very salient in people's minds, although it is not borne out by the data. And I won't show you this figure on the slide, but one thing we also did was to ask people to fill out the same ladder question with their perceptions of mobility, but actually specifically asking them to think about a child who's born in the bottom, but also that puts in a lot of effort, both at school first and then in the job market later, sort of a best case scenario, someone who puts in the max effort, trying to test whether people think that effort will actually improve mobility. And so what we find is that actually people do believe that effort, will improve your chances, but in a very specific way. Typically, people tend to think that effort will get you out of poverty and into, say, the middle class, but very few respondents actually think that effort will take you to the very top. And that's actually quite consistent across countries. So what do these perceptions or misperceptions imply for people's views on policies? It's summarized here on this slide. So what we can see is that most people are quite worried about lack of social mobility and inequality of opportunity. So there's widespread agreement that if you have too little mobility, so if children's outcomes are very highly correlated with their parents' outcomes, that's not a good thing. Most people agree with that. However, people's preferred solution to that problem looks very, very different. And in particular, it again looks very different based on whether you're more left-leaning or right-leaning. And that's true not just for the US, that's true across all these countries. In particular, left-wing respondents who are more pessimistic about mobility, they also want more action from the government. They want more redistribution, more social insurance, more progressive taxes, and especially more equality of opportunity type policies, such as spending on education or health. And this is true in a correlational sense, but it's also confirmed if you do an experiment, as we did, to show a randomly selected subsample of people negative information about mobility, sort of telling them, look, mobility is actually pretty low overall in your country. This increases their support for redistribution. On the other hand, if you're someone who's more right-leaning, then you still think lack of mobility is a very big problem, but you tend to view government as part of the problem rather than the solution. And so you tend to think that the better way to improve equality of opportunity is actually less government action, less government intervention. And this decision about what you want to do about this problem is ultimately mapped to very different attitudes about government. And this has been shown in other work, in particular also a paper I've done with Iliana Kuziemko, Mike Norton, and Emmanuel Saez, which is that trust in government and belief about the scope in government is a very, very key driver of people's views about what should be done about the same problem. The second project draws the link between views on immigration and support for redistribution. So you may wonder why immigration is so relevant for redistribution policy. Well, first of all, immigration was clearly was very much in the debate of many recent elections and is typically a very, topical issue in the media. And it's been suggested on many occasions that if you think about generosity, people have documented that it seems to not travel as well across national, ethnic, or religious lines as within those groups. And that people in general tend to support more redistribution when they think that it benefits those who are more like them, more similar to them. And so we wanted to see whether this is true, at a very high policy level. Does more immigration or more perceived immigration reduce people's support for the welfare state and redistribution policies? And if you think back to our framework at the start, we're again talking about these two key considerations for policy views, namely who people think benefits from redistribution. In this case, is it immigrants, according to them? And then to what extent they think that is fair and deserved. And to do this, we also want to know, of course, whether people have correct perceptions of immigrants to start with. Is it the case that they actually understand correctly the number, the origins, the economic characteristics like education, unemployment, poverty, reliance on government transfers, etc., of immigrants? So in this project, we actually survey more than 22,000 respondents across 6 countries, which are France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US. And our definition of immigrants here, to set ideas straight from the beginning, is foreign-born, someone who's not born in the country. And the reason we do this is because it's the official OECD definition, and it avoids issues such as different citizenship rules in different countries. And for the US, we actually make sure to explicitly ask about legal immigrants. And there's a specific part of the paper that looks at total immigrants, so including illegal immigrants as well, or undocumented immigrants. So what are some key results? So let's start with the perceived and actual number of immigrants by country. So on this graph, each row is one country, and the horizontal axis represents the share of immigrants that is actually in each country. That's the blue diamond, or the average perception of respondents from that country. That's the red square. You can see that in all countries, without exceptions, respondents very starkly overestimate the share of immigrants. So for instance, in the US, people think that around 37% of the population are immigrants, when in fact, the reality is 10% for documented immigrants and up to 14% counting undocumented too. In Sweden, the country where there's actually the most immigrants, respondents are also the most accurate. And in fact, you may wonder what happens if we added second generation immigrants to that figure. So maybe people are just not quite aware. Are you a first generation immigrant? Are you a second generation immigrant? It would still not close the gap. The gaps are very, very big relative to reality. So it is not only a confusion about first versus second generation immigrants. And furthermore, some other findings are that, across the board, people tend to very systematically believe that immigrants are economically weaker, more unemployed, less educated than they are. And they also tend to think that immigrants are more culturally distant from them. So they tend to think they're more likely to be of a different religion, of a different ethnicity than them. And one important question that is directly related to redistribution is to what extent people think that immigrants rely on government transfers. So on this graph, you see the share of respondents for each country who think that an average immigrant in their country receives at least twice the transfers as the average non-immigrant in their country. And in no country is this actually true. So in none of these countries here, it's true. And yet the share of respondents who think so is not small, except perhaps in Germany, where less than 10% of respondents say so. But it's very significant, for instance, in a country like France, where around a quarter of respondents think that an average immigrant will get twice as many transfers from the government. And we also asked some questions that are targeted more directly at seeing whether people exhibit a bias against immigrants. So more specifically, what we do is we tell respondents about two identical men. So they're identical economically with the same family situation, same income, same age, living in the same place. The only difference we mention about them is that one of them is an immigrant and the other one is not an immigrant. And we call the non-immigrant John, and in the example question, and the immigrant is called Mohammed. And we ask people, so do you think that John pays the same amount of taxes than Mohammed, or more or less? And do you think John gets the same level of government transfers, more or less than Mohammed? And on this figure, you can see the share of respondents who say that Mohammed gets more transfers and pays less taxes than John. And recall that just based on the question and the way we describe these people, there is absolutely no reason to think so. The only, if you want, rational answer, given the info provided, is that they pay the same taxes and they get the same transfers. And actually only Swedish respondents get this right here. So 0% of Swedish respondents think that the immigrant systematically gets more transfers and pays less taxes. But in countries like Italy and France, for instance, and I'm from France, there's actually substantial bias here against immigrants in their country, with more than a third of respondents who say that an immigrant systematically gets more and pays less taxes. You may also wonder whether there's some groups that are more accurate about immigrants. So are there some groups that have more accurate perceptions? Well, misperceptions about immigrants, it turns out, are very, very widespread. So the patterns I just showed you, they're not limited to a small group of people in each sample. No, in fact, it's very widespread. It's true that there's some heterogeneities. So you can point to some groups of people that have more inaccurate perceptions about immigrants. But in general, it is very widespread. People think that immigrants are economically weaker, more unemployed, less educated, more reliant on government transfers, and more culturally distant from them. These misperceptions are particularly largest for those without a college degree, those working in lower paid jobs in sectors that employ many immigrants, and then people who tend to be more right-leaning. And something that's very interesting is that if you take a left and right-leaning respondent in the sample, they will actually perceive the same share of immigrants. So they will be equally wrong, if you want, about how many immigrants are in their country. But they think that immigrants have very different characteristics. So on average, someone who's on the left will not picture the same average immigrant in their mind when they think about it as someone who's on the right. And to finish with our main question, which is, well, what is the link between these perceptions about immigration and support for redistribution? So we performed an experiment. A random half of the sample is asked all these questions about immigrants, their characteristics, their number, etc., before they are asked questions on policies for redistribution, and then vice versa for the other half of the sample. So in a sense, the group who's answering the policy questions first has not been prompted to think about immigration at all, while the other group has just been made to think about immigration in detail before answering policy questions. And what do we find? We find that just making people think about immigrants before asking them questions on policies for redistribution makes them less likely to support redistribution. And the effect is actually pretty strong. And so what explains this? What we can see is that the key predictors, the key reasons for why people will reduce support for redistribution when they think about immigrants is first, the perception that immigrants are economically weaker. So when they think about redistribution, they will tend to think immigrants are more likely to benefit from it because they are economically weaker. But more than that, it's the perception that immigrants free ride, quote unquote, on the system and do not work hard. So people who hold this belief that immigrants do not contribute economically and that they try to take advantage of the welfare state are the people who will really link their views on immigrants to a lower support for redistribution. What is not so predictive, what doesn't matter as much to people, if you ultimately horse race these considerations, is the share of immigrants that they think is in their country or their perceived cultural distance. So when it comes to redistribution, it seems to matter a lot to people what they think about the economic strengths or weakness of immigrants and how hard they think immigrants work and contribute to the country. And, we can also end with a bit of a lesson here on hard facts versus narratives on some topics. We did other things in this experiment. So for instance, we showed people information on the true share of immigrants and their actual origins in their country. And we see that this doesn't shift people's views on redistribution at all. On the other hand, if we tell people a story, so more of a narrative, about a day in the life of a very hardworking immigrant, that has positive impacts on support for redistribution. And why? Well, through the lens of what we just saw, because it counters this free rider narrative that takes hold of people sometimes and that really matters for people's policy views. But even then, it's clear that hard facts just don't work that well, according to our findings on the issue of immigration, because all these narratives about how much immigrants contribute and what they do have a very strong hold. The third project, moving along, is about racial attitudes and support for redistribution. And this is based on this project with Alberto Alesina and Matteo Ferroni. So it's been long known in the US that attitudes towards race shape people's support for redistribution. There have been so many studies showing to what extent, people, for instance, overestimate the amount of government transfers, such as welfare payments, that will go to minorities and specifically African Americans. So issues of race are almost, ineluctably linked to redistribution and policy issues in the US. And so to study this interaction, what we do is purely a US-based survey here. So this is not across countries. This is for the US. We decided to survey both adults and teenagers aged 13 to 17. And we focus on non-Hispanic Black and white respondents. And we actually oversample Black respondents here so that they represent half of both the adult sample and the teenage sample. And we ask respondents in detail about their perceptions of the economic conditions and the opportunities of both Black and white Americans. And we ask them about their attitudes on racial issues, and in particular, their views about the causes of racial inequities. What do they think causes the gaps that they see in the world? And then we also ask them about their degree of support for race-targeted and general redistribution policies. So why do we ask about those two types of policies? Well, if you think about ways to reduce racial inequities, one way you can think about it is, well, let's directly condition policies, on race. Let's directly have specific state transfers, preferential college admissions, or preferential labor market policies. So those are policies that people call race targeted because they explicitly condition on race. Or you can think of general redistribution, which is income targeted policies, which because, for instance, Black Americans tend to be on average poor, will benefit these groups more, but it's a more indirect sort of intervention. And so what do people think about these two types of interventions? And so what we see very clearly is that if we look at all our results of this very detailed survey, what we see is that across race groups and across political affiliations, people perceive the economic conditions and the opportunities of Black and white Americans differently. So there's clearly disagreements about what people think reality is. So people do not quite agree on how unequal opportunities and outcomes are for different people. They don't agree on that. But by far the biggest disagreement, much bigger than the disagreement about the reality of economic conditions and opportunities, is the disagreement about the perceived causes of racial inequalities. And so consequently, also what should be done to remedy them. So people very much fundamentally disagree on what causes the gaps that we see in the world. And I'll tell you how exactly they disagree. And what's very important is that in the end, people's support for either general redistribution or for targeted policies really doesn't depend on their perceptions of the magnitudes of racial gaps. So it doesn't depend how big you think inequities are. It actually really depends on why you think those gaps exist to start with. And so how do people differ exactly? It may or may not come as a surprise to you, but some of the biggest differences are, again, by political affiliation. So if you just look at, say, white respondents on average, you're going to miss a big picture because white respondents are actually incredibly strongly divided by political affiliation in their views on race. And along many dimensions, people who tend to be, democratic leaning are much more aligned with Black Democrat respondents than they are with white Republican respondents. And so if we wanted to very briefly summarize the views on these two, on these two polars of the spectrum, Black and white Democratic respondents will typically tend to think that, persistent racial gaps are due to past slavery, to longstanding discrimination, to racism, to sort of systemic causes. And they will support income-targeted redistribution and race-targeted policies much more. On the other hand, white Republican respondents in general, on average, will tend to view racial inequities actually primarily as the result of lack of effort and individual decisions. And let me draw the parallel here to, in general, what we know about how these groups view, say, poverty in general, regardless of race. These differences are there too, where people on the right tend to attribute, for instance, lower incomes of anyone rather to lack of effort than to bad luck or adverse circumstances. And as a result, people who are on the right tend to be much less inclined to support redistribution and race-targeted policies to reduce them. What was incredibly striking to us is that these partisan gaps are already very prevalent among teenagers. So people who are aged 13 to 17, they already exhibit essentially very similar partisan gaps in line to their parents' political affiliation. So when I say partisan gaps among teenagers, I mean based on the political affiliation of their parents, teenagers who themselves yet don't have, a political affiliation and don't vote yet, they still respond in a manner that's very aligned with their parents' political affiliation. So these views are already very, very entrenched at a very young age. And so what can we do about this? So we did an experiment here again. And in particular, we show people information about the actual gaps in earnings and opportunities between Black and white people in the US. And we see that this doesn't move people's policy views at all. On the other hand, showing people some of the causes and consequences of systemic racism by explaining, for instance, the long-standing, issues with redlining, difficulties in access to college, building wealth, etc., several generations back, and that still persists today, that actually has impact on people's policy views. And so this is very much in line with what I said, 2 slides ago, which is that simply showing people how unequal circumstances and opportunities are doesn't change their beliefs on why these are unequal, and doesn't change the narrative that they have in their mind and that they believe in about why these gaps exist. And the beliefs that matter most, those about the causes, what causes gaps, are also the most entrenched. So they're also the hardest ones to move. And for instance, some of the respondents were really on the right of the political spectrum. Even if they see such explanations, they will consider them to be left-wing biased. So they will not believe them as much. And the effects are much weaker on some of the right-wing respondents who don't believe that information. And on a tiny scale, this somehow mirrors, some things that we see in the world, which is, although there are clearly large racial gaps along many economic and social dimensions, and along many people, are at least to some extent aware of them, not fully by any means, they still disagree. They especially disagree on what causes them, and hence on the way or even the need to resolve them. That's where the biggest discrepancies lies. And this has important implications for their support for overall redistribution too. So to end with, the 4th project is about some longstanding issues in social sciences about social status, how you rank relative to others, and your views on inequality and fairness. In the policy debate, issues of relative income, which is how much do I make relative to others, and how you perceive yourself relative to your peers, appears to be very important for fairness considerations and views on policies. But how well do people actually know their position relative to others? Well, we're interested in knowing how well people know their position in various reference groups. So by social position, we mean their ranking in the income distribution of a given group. And it's in plural because we're going to think of several different groups here. So we'll consider some large groups, such as people from your cohort, or people living in your city, or people with the same level of education as you, or people in the same sector of work. And also some smaller groups, such as your direct neighbors in your street or in your apartment building, your coworkers at your workplace, even your former schoolmates. And it's actually very challenging to study these because we need data on a lot of things here. We need data on people's perceptions, and we need data on reality. So knowing people's true position, among others, requires knowing the incomes of all other people in that group. And there are many relevant reference groups: sector, education, cohort, etc. And so we will add new data here by linking our own survey data that we design and that we run. We're going to link it to administrative tax returns that contain people's info about their income, their income histories, shocks that have happened to them, like unemployment, disability, health, promotions, for all their reference groups. And we can do this in Denmark. Thanks to cooperation with Statistics Denmark, they allowed us to do that match and have essentially this incredible wealth of information about people that we can then also survey to elicit their perceptions. And so in our survey, we can ask people about where they think they rank among others and about their views on inequality in various policies. And the data can provide us with people's actual positions and their histories. So this is how we do it in a nutshell. So first, we want to know whether people are even aware of the levels of income of various groups. So we will start by asking them about the income distribution of their own reference groups. So the questions that they will see are adapted to them. So they will see directly questions about groups that they're actually part of. So for instance, let's take an example here of one respondent who's born in 1970. So the first questions that these respondents will see is, what is the median income, which we call P50, because it's the 50th percentile. And we explain that in detail to people what we mean. What is the median income in their cohort? So in people born in 1970. And after that, we ask them, what is the median income in all these other groups that you're part of? So for instance, this respondent here is born in 1970, is a man, has a master or PhD, lives in Copenhagen, and works in finance and insurance. So these are the groups that he will be asked about. Basically, people like you along that dimension, what's their median income, how much do they make, etc. And then for each of these reference groups, we will also ask people to rank themselves on a ladder. Sorry, I forgot to put the image here, but it's the same type of ladder I showed you earlier, but that's much more detailed, that has 100 rungs. And so people have to really put a slider and place themselves at a given percentile in each group. And so now we know what people know about the income distribution for the groups and their own position. And so one of the main findings is represented here on this slide. This is done for the cohort. How do you think you rank relative to others that are of the same age as you? And this key pattern will be visible for other reference groups too. So it's something that we call center bias. So on the horizontal axis, you can see people's actual position in their cohort, where they actually rank. And then on the vertical axis, you can see people's perceived position. And so the red points are the average perception of people in a given position, and the white points are the median perception. But you see that they're very close together. So you immediately see this sort of inverted S pattern, which we call center bias, which is that respondents who are ranked lower tend to overestimate their position, while respondents who are truly ranked higher tend to underestimate their position. And the same pattern is visible for all other groups. So if I put them all on the same chart here, for instance, where people rank themselves in their municipality, in their city, or in their education group, say among others who have a bachelor degree, you can see the same inverted S pattern, whereby everybody who's ranked lower tends to overestimate how high they rank, and those ranked higher underestimate it. So this is what we call center bias. People tend to think they're closer to the center of a group than they truly are. And where do these misperceptions come from? In principle, mechanically, it could come from either being wrong about your own income or being wrong about others' incomes, or a mix of both. And so we can actually show that it comes very clearly from being wrong about others' incomes, and in a systematic way. So to summarize it, people who are poor themselves tend to think everyone else is poorer too. And people who are richer will tend to think that everyone else is richer too. So people who are in a lower position, they will rank themselves higher relative to others, not because they misperceive their own income, but because they tend to underestimate how rich everyone else is. And conversely, people who are ranked higher, they will tend to place themselves lower because they overestimate the incomes of others. In their mind, others are richer than they truly are. And in fact, look at here where misperceptions are the largest. It's actually for the education and the sector groups. So these are also the groups in which people do not realize to what extent, some people are highly paid. And this is also the group where lower income respondents tend to most overestimate their ranking. And actually, if you look at some smaller groups, and by smaller groups, I mean things like coworkers or neighbors or former schoolmates. Well, if we ask about those groups, what we find is that we will see the same center bias. It will also be apparent for these small reference groups. And the misperceptions at the bottom will be the largest when people compare themselves to coworkers in their own firm. And so there's this parallel between people making a big mistake when they think about others in the same sector, the large group, and in their company, in their immediate firm workplace, that's a smaller equivalent. And so people are much better at ranking themselves in their municipality or among their neighbors than they are at ranking themselves among coworkers in the same firm or sector. Actually, make smaller errors when ranking themselves among their former schoolmates that they went to school with during their teenage years than when ranking themselves among their current coworkers. So the patterns are just very consistent. If you view coworkers in a firm as a small scale equivalent to everyone in the sector, you're bad at ranking yourself in these work-related groups. And if you view neighbors as a smaller scale equivalent of the municipality, you're much better at ranking yourself among those type of groups. So information clearly doesn't flow well among coworkers in the same sector and even within the same firm. And so which types of inequalities do people consider to be the most unfair? Well, ironically, exactly those inequalities that are much bigger than they think, namely inequalities between coworkers in a firm or sector and with people with the same education. People tend to think that if conditional on education, there's still inequality, that's not fair. If conditional on living in the same city, there's inequality between people in the same city, that's more okay. So people are more accepting of inequalities that are conditional on factors that they think are less relevant for income, like municipality, sector, firm, municipality, age, or gender, than of inequalities that are conditional on things that are crucial in their mind for shaping income, like education, sector, and firm. So in a sense, people understand that if you live in the same city, you will have different levels of income since you don't do the same, you have different lifestyles, etc. But if you have the same level of education or you work in the same sector or firm, people are much less willing to accept the reasons for why people end up with such different incomes in the end. And paradoxically, these are exactly the inequalities that they underestimate the most. And to end with, how does this social position shape your views on inequality? So what we see is that people who are ranked higher in each group tend to think that income inequality within that particular group is more fair. So they also tend to think that income differences in that group are due to differences in effort rather than luck. They believe that their own hard work has paid off, and they also tend to think that higher income earners deserve their income. So very many views are affected by where you actually rank yourself relative to others. If you rank higher in a group, you're also much more likely to vote for right-of-center parties and to support less redistribution. And we can also see that some of these views are very sticky. They don't fluctuate over time when your position changes. So for instance, political views, it's pretty sticky. Others are much more volatile and they move when your position moves, such as, for instance, the perceived fairness of inequality. And what happens when people's position changes after some specific events? So in the data, we can see what happened to you over time. So for instance, did you suffer an unemployment spell? Did you get promoted at work? Did you get a hospitalization or a disability shock? And what we can see is that a negative event makes people think that inequality is less fair. And a positive event, like a promotion at work, makes them think that inequality is more fair. So there's these effects of events that happen to you on your views about how fair things are. There is much less effect on stickier views like your political affiliation or your perception of how much of success is due to effort versus luck. And the last thing I want to show you is we informed a random half of the sample, you can call this the treatment group, about their true social position in their reference groups before we asked them about their views on fairness, effort versus luck, etc. So remember this respondent at the beginning, this man born in 1970, working in finance and insurance. Well, that person guessed that they thought that they're ranked at P70, at the 70th percentile. But unfortunately, we had to tell them during the experiment that they actually only ranked at P57. So they're 13 positions lower than they thought. And when we inform respondents about their misperceptions, what happens is that when they realize they're ranked lower than they thought, they're more likely to say that inequality is now more unfair than they previously thought across all reference groups. So to conclude, some of the core factors that shape people's views on policies are the fairness considerations and who they think gains and loses from the current situations and from the proposed policies. And these are the aspects of people's thinking and considerations that we need to study. And here we looked at it from 4 angles that were all about this intrinsic concern of who benefits and who loses and how fair that is. So we looked at mobility and equality of opportunity, immigration, racial attitudes, and social positions relative to others. And there are many more, so plenty more work to do. And I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was really fantastic. And I'll just share my screen and start out with an initial set of questions mostly. And hopefully we'll see more. I can see one question in the Q&A, but more will appear. So I think as a development economist, most of my comments are coming from my own research background. And naturally, so we're all influenced by what we're studying. And early on, what I learned was that income is really not a good measure of well-being or standard of living. But of course, in developing countries, there are many reasons. One of the biggest reasons were consumption smoothing challenges, measurement error, recall bias. A lot of that is taken care of in developed countries through tax records. But I still keep wondering, because deprivation is still very multidimensional and income is just one aspect of that deprivation, or living standards more generally, right? It's education, health, life expectancy, some of the things you talk about in your papers and in today's talk as well. And I wonder if this constant conversation around income-based mobility, which it is not, this measurement income doesn't really account for, all the social protection benefits people receive, like, food stamps or school lunch, your children get to study free, or better healthcare. Is that subtly resulting in this idea that people don't value the social protection that they're actually getting a lot, because they're not really seeing it in the measures that we're constantly using in news headlines or discussing? So I'm just wondering, why isn't there a greater focus on using consumption expenditure, which is largely used in practically every other developing country in the world to study welfare, but not in the US, and especially in the developed countries? I mean, it's great that we have tax records, but is it really limiting us in other ways? So that's the first question. The second was that, are we looking to solve complex problems with fewer options? So for instance, again, fundamentally in development economics, it's pretty much well known or well accepted that poverty has many causes. I mean, nobody is going to ever say that poverty has 2 causes or 4 causes. It's limited resources, it's shocks. I'm going to call shocks, all sorts of drought shocks, rainfall shocks, climate shocks, that's luck part of it. But also there is aspirational failure. There's aspiration poverty traps. And maybe that's sort of luck, effort, but access to schooling, social networks, discrimination. So isn't it important to accept that some problems are really deep and complex, and that some of the polarization is because we're really trying to solve them with too few options, saying that it's just effort or just luck? But really, it's really neither. It's just this whole big pie with lots of small things and interactions. I have 2 more thoughts if I can move on to my next slide. Yeah. Then I was wondering a little bit that, do perceptions about mobility differ for Black males and Black females? We see a lot about Black and whites, but just because we see a lot of that, how the test score gap, especially for Black males and females, it's really reversing. Black females tend to do a lot better on their performance on reading, math, test scores in the US. Is it reflected in the data, or is it misperception? Is the same? It really left me wondering whether people have this nuanced understanding of some of these other aspects of improvements in mobility. It was both disappointing and a little bit, I would say that encouraging to see that there is high correlation between parents and children's attitude and on perceptions about mobility. The reason I say it's disappointing, of course, for the same reasons that we always worry about. But it was also encouraging in the sense that we know it's nurture related, right? I mean, we know a lot of this high correlation is not just, this is not restricted to mobility. I've seen this in gender norms in developing countries, on lots of other aspects, any sort of norm related or attitudes. So perhaps there is a positive thing that maybe early interventions at children, more data-oriented approach in schools, giving more children facts, making them work through more facts-related and understanding may perhaps decrease this correlates over time. I also really like this sentence that you had in your paper. Saliency and narratives shape people's view on immigration more deeply than hard facts. In your paper, it was sort of a positive spin in the sense it was debunking some of their incorrect beliefs. But more broadly, I actually wonder, isn't it more important that we learn how to see hard facts? Or that narratives can be so subjective, they can be written by people with their own goals and political motivations, which may not have the same economic, there are trade-offs. So I don't know. I felt with the view that we need to go with more with hard facts. So, and I thought, okay, what do we do as educators, right? I mean, as professors, as school teachers, what do people do to solve this? And the last thing, the statement that you had in your paper in the introduction, I was really taken by this statement in the introduction, which said, it's impossible to write about racial issues without acknowledging that making these categorical distinctions in research itself may be perpetuating them. It was written right in the introduction in a field that is constantly told not to talk about your limitations in the introduction, push it all to the conclusion. It was very interesting, but also it resonated with me a lot of, Carla Hoff's work on identity and how just making identity salient in all these surveys leads to so many different responses. So I guess my question was also, have you worried about this, that you're making identity salient right at this beginning of the survey, and how much is it going to bias your responses and your treatment effects? I'll stop there. I have lots. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, great questions. And we could talk for definitely another hour easily, if not more, on these. Thank you very much. So I took some notes here to remember them all. Let me go in order. Your first question is, why limit ourselves to income in a way? Is that not actually very restrictive? And I will say, yes, it's very restrictive, not in the way you necessarily mentioned it, rather that there's other types of, mobility problems in terms of education, in terms of occupations and jobs that people get, in terms of network, that are also adding. It's not just about the income as a sort of final result. And in this particular project, we didn't study it, but people are studying it more and more. For instance, what's the chance that children from college-educated parents attend college or not? And so I think these are really important, also inequalities and even social capital, like the networks you have access to. And absolutely. And I think plenty more products to do on these other measures of mobility or lack of mobility that are not just income. I do think that one reason that, I would use consumption data, for instance, but more as a complement, is because, consumption, if you want disposable income, is very much the result of market income, but also policy intervention already. And so it is very, very relevant when you try to measure welfare, of course, etc. But if we think about what are the opportunities to someone, how much can they do sort of without the exposed transfers that correct for some of the inequality, in a sense, your market income is the relevant measure. So if you can't generate that market income because opportunities are so stacked against you, that's something important to know, rather than only after government transfers, there will be a given consumption. So I think I would certainly want to use consumption, but as a complement rather than as the sort of exclusive measure here. And then your other comment was absolutely true as well, which is, are we trying to find sort of simple causes or solutions? And I hope not in the questionnaires. So one of the goals is to exactly not be like political polls, just everything's black and white, but ask questions for different angles on different situations to actually try to see, are people thinking about things in a more nuanced way? So for instance, when we say, is effort mainly the result, is outcomes mainly the result of effort or luck? We try to give people a gradient for this, and to then ask, what type of circumstances do you think matter a lot, etc. So the goal is to move beyond, like very simplistic poll-like questions here for sure. There's plenty more improvements to do. I completely agree, but I do think it's really important to test about all these dimensions. And then on your final slide, a really important points there too. So one of the things I didn't talk about at all and that you mentioned is that, yes, there are some gender differences, even conditional on race. And I think that's something to keep digging in further. So there's plenty of things to look at here, including among the teenagers, where we do see very different views among, different genders and even within race. So I think that's something to be explored. I don't have any results here, but it's very much something to explore. And yes, I do worry a lot about what I write. So that sentence that you quoted at the end is, something that's people are discussing and talking about, whether it makes sense to to talk about race using these terms or what terms we should use. So it's something I consistently try to worry about and want to make sure that it's done right. I was very willing to contribute sort of these statistics here, in a sense, to the policy debate, but without having the solution to all these very, very deep-rooted problems. What was one thing I'm forgetting from your last slide, which was the middle point. I forgot what you asked there.
On saliency and facts.
Yes.
What should we do as educators?
Yes.
What should be our goal?
Yes.
Yeah.
So on some topics, narratives and salience are very, very much, core drivers, as opposed to, say, just hard facts. It's not true for everything, but it is true for some topics. And I think, as educators, I do think we have to keep providing the facts. But when we actually have explanations, like sort of what is the process through which things have come to be this way, that can be much more powerful and important. Of course, we don't always know it for everything, but wherever we have sufficient evidence to actually make these statements, it can be much more important to explain things rather than just provide facts, I think.
Thank you. And there are a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so I'll start. I can read them out loudly to make it easier. So John V has a question: at what point do race-targeted policies become racist and divisive?
So could you clarify your question a bit, John? At what point do you mean, in the policy debate, or I'm not quite sure how to understand this question.
I don't. If Kyle can help us out here. Okay, maybe till he figures out. But maybe one thing that I have read in this matter is, okay, maybe I'm going to try and interpret. I don't know if I'm going to do this correctly, but as a moderator, I'm going to try and do this. So for example, there is all these cutoffs we have, right? I mean, I've read, at least I know this in the context of India and perhaps here, right? Having lower cutoffs, for instance, for people of different racial backgrounds or gendered quota, not quotas, but let's say lower TESCO cutoffs for getting into programs. So that is a targeting policy to help increase enrollment, but people can also perceive that as somewhat racist, because then you're saying this person cannot do as good as the others can. I don't know, John, if I have, but it seemed to me that it's probably in that direction. It's some of the stuff that I've read myself.
So I think here, I can only tell you about the sort of research findings of how people perceive these policies. And it's clear that the support is very different among people of different races and people of different political affiliation. What we see is that in principle, many people agree that more has to be done to sort of improve opportunities and outcomes for African Americans, but they very much disagree on sort of how this has to be done in practice. And specifically policies like preferential labor market policies or preferential college admissions, they're actually people are very divided in their support for it. So even among Black respondents, the support is like, almost 50-50 in terms of support opposition to such policies. And among white respondents, the support for these policies is very low. If you think of a policy like reparations, there we see a very strong support among Black respondents and a very low support among white respondents, actually regardless of political affiliation. And those patterns are again there among teenagers too. So that's sort of the views that people have, at least in this survey, on the support for some possible race-targeted policies.
Okay, I'm going to read out the next question. Is there a specific reason Black Republicans were excluded while Black Democrats were included in the left versus right example, explaining differentiating perceptions on racial inequality?
Yes, excellent question. So obviously explained in more detail in the paper. But in our sample, actually, Black Republicans are a very small share, turn out to be a very, very small share of the sample. And so we can see the results, including them, but they're actually a really small share that ends up, not moving the results. So basically, the bulk of our Black respondents say that they're more Democrat leaning. And the reason that in that slide, I sort of stylized these groups together is because those are groups that turn out to have more aligned views on all these issues. So their views are kind of closer together within group than they are, in this case, for instance, with white Republicans. If you're interested in the actual, all the stats, in the paper, it is always split by race and political affiliation to see all the patterns in detail.
Okay. The next question is, you stated that opinions on policy were closely tied to political affiliation. Do you think that partisanship and increasing polarization drive these options, or could it be vice versa?
Very good question. I would say $1 billion question. So we don't know based on, this research, or I would say, existing research to date, to what extent, what's causing what really here. This would be very hard to identify. You can certainly imagine a feedback loop, and so then it becomes almost a chicken and egg where it's actually a reinforcing feedback loop that's happening. So very important question, and a big area in political economy that people are trying to answer.
Okay, there's a question. Okay, here's a person I know, so I'm going to say this is from my colleague. A particularly worrisome finding of your work is that facts do not move people's opinion. Example, in the work on race in the US, because people think it's biased news sources. Are you planning on any work on looking more at people's trust on information?
Yeah, I think this is very important. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons that even like explaining, for instance, like some of the causes of systemic racism, discrimination is not moving some of the people. You can see that these tend to be the people who will then say this info was not true info. This was actually sort of left-leaning. And so it's clear that the trust in the source of info matters a lot. And I know of quite a lot of work going on, again, in political economy, both theoretically, sort of how this different trust in different sources of info, even if you start from relatively similar beliefs, can actually make you diverge drastically over time and end up in radically different sort of belief systems because of the different trust you place on info. And I think people are trying to study what's exactly causing it, and whether it's also true, particularly say in the US or also in other countries very strongly. So very important questions that I don't have the answer to, but I think I'm going to probably do work on it, and then many other people are too.
The next question asks if you've also looked into differences between rural and urban populations.
Yes, excellent question. So we do have exactly people's location. So if I didn't mention something very explicitly, it's because, for instance, the heterogeneity wasn't that big. And, I sort of focused on the main heterogeneity. But people's place matters in many ways. So in many of these projects, we do look at how local factors, for instance, your local share of immigrants or the economic conditions of immigrants in your locality, how that shapes your views. And they're typically correlations. So people are influenced by their local experience in various ways, for sure.
Can I follow up on that actually? But it's not as large as the political affiliation.
So
there is just some difference in rural urban, but it's not as stark that the political political affiliation.
That's right. Now you can of course say that political affiliation itself is not exogenous to a rural urban. It is correlated, and that's very true. The same way it's not exogenous to income. But if you sort of put everything in at once, political affiliation turns out to be sort of the main variable for at least most of the topics I spoke about here.
I see. And the last question that I can see so far is, should respondents be targeted based on their experience or knowledge related to the focus issue? while still separating the responses through bias. I say this because a lot of surveys produce interesting results, but remain buried or curdled due to the unreliability of some portion of the respondents.
That's an interesting question. So the way we try to get respondents depends a little bit on the survey. So for instance, in the survey on racial perceptions and attitudes, we actually wanted to really oversample some specific groups. In others, we try to be actually broadly representative. So it's hard to know much about people before you sort of ask them. And once they're in your survey, you want to avoid dropping them differentially. So in practice, we sort of let everyone finish, but ex post, we implement a lot of checks to see whether people give careless answers or whether they rush through the survey and don't pay attention. So there's plenty of methods which typically come from psychology and political science doing surveys to actually check that sort of data quality ex post as well. In addition to all the methods and tips you can do before you design your survey, while designing it, to actually ensure that people can pay attention and that you can check the quality. So.
Great. Those are all the questions on the Q&A box. So thank you so much, Stephanie, once again. This was great, and our timing is perfect. 4:45, we wanted to end 4:48. Thank you again for such a fabulous talk and your work.
Thank you all very much for attending. Have a great day.
Bye.